All right, good morning, everyone. My name's Mike Hobbs. I'm an elder and a member of the Adult Education Committee, and it's really my pleasure here today to be able to introduce Dr. Brennan Breed. We're really in for a treat, so I appreciate you all coming and coming for this portion of adult education. So as you'll see, the topic is the Bible and Politics, Part 2. Dr. Lamont, Joel Lamont, gave part 1, and now we're in for part 2, but it's really a standalone, so if you didn't attend that, you're still in good shape, and you don't need to worry about what occurred last week. So let me provide an introduction. Dr. Brennan Breed has just an amazing resume. He's Associate Pastor of Old Testament Columbia Theological Seminary and Theologian in Residence at First Presbyterian Church of Marietta. He's author of the book Nomadic Text, which was published in 2014, and co-author of Daniel, a commentary, which was published also in 2014. That was a busy year. So that was published with Carol Newsom. Dr. Breed is currently writing a commentary on the book of Daniel for the Interpretation series and has just submitted a manuscript or co-authored a book about the impact of Alexander the Great's conquest and daily life and religious belief of Egyptians and Judeans, written with David Hankins. He lives in Decatur with his wife, Catherine, who's a religious teacher at Lovett School. They have 2 kids, Freddie and Margaret Ann, and 2 miniature schnauzers, Shadow and Zuzu. He loves making noise on the fiddle, mandolin, and banjo, cooking, hiking, and talking about obscure and odd Bible stories with strangers and recent acquaintances. And you may also know him that he and Joel are 2 fists the hot dill pickers. So a man of many talents. So if you'd welcome him up to the podium, we're very glad to have you.
Thanks. Thank you, Mike. Thanks very much. And thanks to Milo for running AV and sound. So yes, my name's Brennan Breed. I teach Old Testament at Columbia Seminary. So glad to be here. So glad to see you all. Some familiar faces, some new ones to me. If you, after the education, before the service, if you want to stop, say hi, ask questions, I'll be available and around. Let me open us in prayer, and then I'll get to our topic for today. Gracious God, you who have convened us today, who have gathered us, the people that you have called to be your own, to follow you, to love you, and to love each other, and to love the world. We pray that you'd help us to think about how we organize ourselves, about how we organize our community, our church, our state, our nation. Help us to consider how power functions amidst and among the many roles that we play, from our family life to the globe. Help us to see you at work in these many spaces. Please guide us with your providence and your peace. Amen. So last week, I think, Joel Lamont talked about kings. Is that true? Okay, good. Yes, I should have called Joel and asked him about that, but great. So this is a part of a 2-part series about politics and the Bible. So lots of people are interested in the question about what does the Bible have to say about politics. I'm not here, just to make it clear, I'm not here to pitch you on particular policies or a particular party. What I'm here to talk about is the kind of shape of our politics. Many people throughout history have assumed that the Bible really does back the idea of kingship. That is to say, the figure of King David looms large in the Old Testament, and the figure of Jesus, the King, looms large in the New Testament. So many Christians have thought that kingship is just kind of the normal thing for God to be interested in. So last week, Joel talked about the complicated, I'm guessing, if I know Joel, the complicated nature of kingship. That is to say that kingship is authorized and supported by God in many ways in the Old Testament, and some ways in the New, Jesus as the king. But it's complicated. So kingship is not just a single story. That is, God has a lot of ideas about kings, and not all of them are good. Not all of them are supportive of the concept. So today we're going to talk more about this other form of politics that existed in ancient Israel and that we can see running through the New Testament and the New Testament community, and that even runs through this room today. So that is to say, we're going to come to the 21st century, but we're going to start in the ancient Near East. Now, My basic conviction is that ancient Israel is an ancient Near Eastern people. So we're going to think a little bit about the ancient Near East. What was this culture that ancient Israel was a part of? And we'll think about how politics worked in that world. And then we'll try to think forward to today. So, big questions that we're asking these couple of weeks. How does the Bible depict political power and political systems? And how does contemporary politics engage biblical texts and traditions? So, as I said, the cultural context of ancient Israel is basically what we might think of as the Fertile Crescent. So this kind of band of very fertile land, typically kind of the rivers of the Nile, and then the Tigris and the Euphrates over here, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, modern-day Turkey and Syria and Iraq. And then this area over here, the Nile, which floods every year, usually floods very nicely, and makes it possible to have a lot of people who live there in the ancient world. In between these two areas was what people call the bridge. The bridge is an area that some people call the Eastern Mediterranean or the Levant, which just means like where the sun rises, a French term. But it's what we might call today Palestine and Israel, and then Lebanon, parts of Syria, and then up into southern Turkey. So this eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean is kind of a land bridge between these two major empires. The important part here is that these rivers, the Nile and the Tigris and the Euphrates, allowed for huge populations of people very early in history. So the invention of writing was down here in Sumer, about the year 3300 BC. Because they had gotten so many people, they had so much food, they didn't have money back then, but they had so much stuff, resources, what we might think of as money today. They had so much power there, it started to consolidate. And because they needed irrigation systems, they needed to all cooperate at a very early date. So they needed centralized authority. The Nile, people call it the cage of the Nile. Nile Valley is very, very narrow. It's a very narrow band of habitable land. And it floods every year, which means your land goes away every year. It completely goes under the water, and then it reemerges and it looks different every year. So you can't just have a piece of land and have it be yours. So very early in Egypt's history, they had a pharaoh, a central political authority, who made sure that everyone got a good piece of land. Like a just measurer of land was basically the early role of Pharaoh. But it also meant that you couldn't just go out in the wilderness over here and live. No one lived out there. There's no water. So the water's only here in this little narrow band. So everyone had to cooperate together, which led to centralized political systems. This area is different. This area around Israel is what we call a dry farming area. They have to get rain. They do get some rain, a little bit from the Mediterranean, but it dries out pretty quickly. And the Fertile Crescent is a crescent because there's no one living in the middle. At least in the ancient world, there were some nomads, some Bedouin, some Arabs who would travel through these areas, who knew these areas well and could survive, but most people couldn't. There wasn't enough water to sustain large communities, even around Israel. Israel was never very strong, it was never very powerful, it was never very rich. It never was very populous compared to its neighbors, but it was the bridge between them. These empires were rich and powerful and had armies, and they wanted to fight each other. And so they kept crossing over Israel. So Israel was the place, the crossing point, the bridge between these two major powers. As a result, Israel, from a very early stage, along with many other peoples in this little area, developed alternative political systems. They didn't necessarily need kings because they didn't have giant irrigation systems. They didn't need to cooperate in the same way to survive. So, starting from a very early point, they had different ideas about how to organize themselves. All right, so in the ancient Near East, there's basically two systems of political organization. There's that monarchy, right, which Joel talked about in the Bible, and this is Pharaoh here, getting ready to kill some people. There's people down here, all the different peoples of the world represented, looking different in their different hairstyles and different facial expressions and so on. But these are the folks of the world, and Pharaoh is protecting you, the Egyptian people, from all these foreigners who are threatening you. Over here we got an image, this is from Marc Chagall, this is 20th century, but just a picture of King David, right, who in some ways represents this power. The people of Israel asked for a king, according to the Bible, because they were scared. They were scared of their neighbors. The Philistines were too strong, too powerful. The Philistines had iron weapons, and Israel didn't have any iron smelting technology, so they had no powerful weapons to fight against these Philistines. Philistines came and took whatever they wanted whenever they wanted. And the people said, we need a king who can maybe organize us to get some iron smelting technology so we can get some good swords. And then so we can organize a military, so we can feed the military. So we have to have excess that we're producing, so we have to have a king who's organizing us to have the excess so that we can feed the military, right? So you have to have all this stuff. So they want a military and they ask for it. So they get a king. And eventually, after the sort of false start of Saul, we get David. Okay, so that happens in ancient Israel. But there is this alternative system that exists the entire time, and actually in this region is much older. And that is the tribe and clan system. The tribe and clan system. Now, we think this existed in Egypt, and this existed in Mesopotamia as well, but was not represented in their political system very clearly. When we read ancient political documents from Mesopotamia and from Egypt, we don't see this at work very clearly. But we think that they existed. So that is, people from ancient times organized themselves in some family terms, right? A clan is a kind of a smaller group. A tribe is a larger group, an association of clans, these kind of family groups. Now, we actually know, this is interesting, we know from some ancient sources that these were fictitious. These are not genetic, not biological, ever. We have records of ancient people from the area around Israel, but 1,000 years before Israel existed, who are asking a local king, they're tribes people, they're asking a local king for the ability to change their family. They want to take their clan and go to a different tribe. And the king says, sure. The king has to authorize it in some way, but this group wanted to associate with a different family. And we know that there's all kinds of what anthropologists call fictitious family relationships, but as we know today, real families have non-biological relationships in them too. I'm related to my parents-in-law. So is that a fictitious or a real biological relationship? So all to say, in the ancient world, like today, they had complicated family relationships that were often negotiated between people over periods of time. So this clan and tribe system was decentralized. Typically, they didn't have one ruler or one leader for any of these tribes or clans. They had elders, people who had some kind of authority in the community, but they're not named. They're rarely ever named. Who were the elders? It's all the people who are older and have some kind of measure of authority. So they have to negotiate among themselves, and they have to listen to the people whom they're supposed to be representing. So we have some kind of early form of representative democracy. A lot of anthropologists and historians of this part of the world will call this proto-democracy or primitive democracy, which makes it sound, I don't know, it's kind of a weird name, right? But I just call it democracy because it looks a lot like what we think about Athenian democracy, like the democracy of Athens in the classical age. People had to negotiate with each other what they wanted, and then the elders had to represent them in negotiations with representatives from other clans and tribes. And we see this in the Bible. In fact, this is the preferred organization of ancient Israel in the Bible. When they are birthed as a people, they are birthed as a group of tribes and clans. And that seems to be like the organizing authority. So in Exodus, we'll talk about Exodus in a minute, but when they received the law in Sinai, it doesn't talk about kings. Kings aren't mentioned in Exodus. Makes sense. They don't like Pharaoh. They don't like kings. God freed them from Pharaoh. God was supposed to be their king at the beginning when they're organized as a people, and it's the elders in the book of Exodus, according to the law, who are supposed to negotiate things amongst each other. And then in the book of Deuteronomy, it mentions a king. Moses says, one day you might ask for a king, but you know what the king's job is in Deuteronomy? This is in Deuteronomy 17, so you can check me. The king, if we think of Deuteronomy as the constitution of ancient Israel, the king exists, but the king has, two jobs. The first job is not really a job. It says don't acquire any wealth, which seems to be like not what kings do, right? If you're a king, you kind of want stuff. That's why you're a king, right? You killed people to get this job, so you want the benefits, right? That is to say, in ancient Israel, they're told if someone becomes a king, you're not supposed to acquire any stuff at all. You're supposed to be poor. Now, second, your actual job is to read the law every day from beginning to end, and that's it. So justice and law, which was the job of kings in the ancient Near East, in the Bible, Deuteronomy 17, no, that's actually the elders take care of that, and the people are supposed to do that. They're supposed to take care of, the law courts are supposed to be representative with groups of people making decisions based on witnesses. So, like us. And then if you think about the king as well as being a political authority, well, in Deuteronomy, the elders are supposed to negotiate representing their own people what the group does. The military, sorry, that's the job of the elders. So that is to say, ancient Israel seems to hate kings. They seem to think kings are of no good, of no worth. And it's only later that ancient Israel ends up asking for a king because they need an army, like an official military system. But this idea of clans and tribes persists throughout ancient Israel's history. They keep remembering themselves as clans and tribes ultimately. And later, when they lose the kingship, they end up realizing, Yahweh, God, was our king all along. And we've got a political system that can work no matter where we are. So Ezekiel, a priest who was exiled from ancient Judah, from ancient Jerusalem, he was taken away to Babylon. And in Babylon, in the book of Ezekiel, we have Ezekiel meeting, several times in the book it mentions this, meeting with the elders of the people. And they're talking together about what to do and how to organize themselves in exile. And they realized their political system wasn't tied to a place or a single person. That they had an ancient political system that God had given them all along. So, you can see this at work in these texts, especially where they talk about distributing power. And there's a word that appears in the Bible that seems so normal to us that we miss it every time. But in the ancient world, this word was a bombshell. This was radical. Do you see it? Do you see the radical word? Which word is the most radical of this? Which would have made kings do a spit take, It's the word the people. Yeah, the word people didn't exist in the ancient world in any language that we know, except in Hebrew. Yeah, is that weird? That's weird, right? This is weird. The word subjects existed. So kings, every single inscription we've got from the ancient world, from Mesopotamia, from Egypt, from the Hittites, who were the kings in Turkey, the kings of this entire region, we can't find a single inscription that mentions the people. There's no word for it. The Hebrew word for people is the word for grandfather, am. They took the word grandfather and had to repurpose it to mean people, because they didn't have a word for that. Why wouldn't the kings want you to have a word for the people? Because that's dangerous. Because if you start thinking of yourself as the people rather than the subjects of a king, then you might start thinking of yourself as having a political authority that is separate from the king. It's a radical political idea that there is a group called the people that has ultimate authority, sovereignty, we might say, political sovereignty. They had that idea in ancient Israel, and they invented a word for it, repurposed a word for it. And that word was the people. So Moses, the story in Exodus 18, which seems like an afterthought, Moses is the one in charge. He's the king, right? Moses is the one who leads them out from Pharaoh. He organizes them. He stands up for them, represents them in front of Pharaoh, takes them away, right? Uses his kind of royal staff to separate the waters, right? He's the king, right? What else is Moses? What's Moses' job? Prophet, maybe, sort of? But he looks like a king. Pharaoh would have thought he was the king of the Hebrews or whatever. So Moses then tries to lead, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work very well. Remember Jethro, this guy who's a nomad, right? He's a Midianite, a nomadic sheep herder, part of the Midianite people who we know in the ancient world moved around and organized themselves as clans, not kings, since time immemorial. Jethro says, I got an idea for you. You should try this out. Moses, you grew up in Egypt. All you know is kings. That's all he knows. The Hebrews who are alive grew up in slavery. All they know is kings. Jethro says, I got a new idea. It's this idea that comes from my part of the world where we have to wander around all the time. We don't have palaces. We have to organize ourselves flexibly all the time, and we have to represent kind of our desires to each other in a group. Where are we going to go? Are we going to fight these people? Are we going to try to take this stuff? Whatever. Jethro says, I got an idea. It's distributive governance. And Moses probably said, what? What is that? He'd never heard this. He was in Egypt his whole life. And then Moses finally says, okay, I shouldn't do this all myself. I shouldn't be a king. So he chose capable people from all Israel and made them heads over the people, heads over the people, as in they have some sort of governance role, but the people ultimately is the group that's part of this, that is being governed, but also that has a role in this. As leaders of the thousands, the hundreds, the fifties, and the tens, they start to organize themselves into groups, you all do this in Presbyterian churches, right? You know, the little committees, and then there's the bigger committees, right? Yeah, they start to do the committee work, right? Because, as we know, committee work is so fun. So we start to hear about the elders, right? The elders are the ones that organize to actually ask for the king in 1 Samuel. They're the ones that say we can't defend ourselves. But the elders want to retain power, and they do. So later on, another one, this is Joshua, end of Joshua, summoning all Israel, including elders, leaders, judges, officers. That is to say, there's no king. There's all these different roles. There's like these different positions, and they all have to talk together about what they want to do. Joshua's not a king. He's just a convener. He's a ruling elder. All right, so then we get this interesting story from ancient Israel. This is the northern kingdom of Israel. This is 1 Kings 16. People imagine that once you get a king in Israel, then you get real kings. That is to say, they govern like kings everywhere else. But there are these stories that pop out at us that start to make us ask questions about where does the political authority actually come from, even when they have kings in ancient Israel. So 1 Kings 16, it's kind of a skip-over chapter for a lot of people, but it's an important one. It's about this guy named Omri, who becomes king through a coup. He's a general, and he kills the king of the northern kingdom and then seizes power, but he can't just seize power all by himself. So this guy Zimri is a general as well. So it says in verse 16 of 1 Kings 16, all Israel made Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that day in the camp. All the people end up making him king. He can't just become king by his own declaration, his own right or something like that, sovereign right of kings. So then there's a guy named Zimri who wants to become king as well. He's a rival general, and they fight each other. And so 1 Kings 16:21 says, then all the people of Israel were divided in two parts. Half of the people followed Tibni to make him king, and half followed Omri. But the people who followed Omri overcame the people who followed Tibni, and then Tibni ended up dying, so Omri became king over all Israel. This is a strange story if you're a historian of the ancient Near East, because the people don't ever make a Babylonian king, they don't ever make an Assyrian king, they don't ever make an Egyptian king. The people don't do anything. So for the people here in this story to have the ability to pick sides and have a fight with each other, and basically one side is bigger, right? We're about to do this in November. The people are split into roughly two parts, and they each want a leader to be in charge, and they will, whichever side's bigger, gets to put their person in charge. Sounds a lot like representative democracy, even though they have a king. So here's just a couple of these verses I read. But this one is the real kicker. So when David ends up becoming king, he doesn't crown himself, and it's not God who crowns him. It's the people who crown him, from the representatives, the elders. And this is in 2 Samuel 5. So all the elders of Israel came to David at Hebron. So David had gotten the elders of Hebron, just one little city in the south of Israel. It's in the area of Judah. One little city to crown him king. So he gets all the people from the northern tribes, all the tribes of Israel to come down to him. So he's already king, but just king of one little tiny town. And all the elders of all the people come to this town, and they end up making him king. But before they make a king, they make a covenant before Yahweh, before the Lord. A covenant. They have to make a covenant. You know what a covenant is? We're good Presbyterians, right? So we should know. Yeah, a covenant, right? It's an agreement. It's a contract. They made a contract with their king before he became king, with stipulations in there about what he could do and couldn't do. That's a pretty radical thing in the ancient world. Pharaoh doesn't have contracts, right? Like the king of Babylon, Hammurabi does not make contracts with you. Hammurabi tells you what's going to happen, and then it happens because that's the king. If he doesn't say that, then he's not the king. But the idea is that then they anoint him. That is, they pour oil over him, and they say, you're set apart as a special person. But there's a contract. If he breaks the contract, they can call him on it, the elders, and all the people, by extension. Now, like I said, this is unique in the world, but we have, unique in this part of the world to them, what they knew of as the world. But this is very slightly precedented just in this region. So this region over here is Assyria and Sumeria. Babylon would have been right over here. These kind of ancient kingdoms. This is Canaan over here, which had some little kind of city-states, but was really ruled by Egypt at this time. So we've got Egyptian ideas of power over here. Mesopotamian ideas of power over here. But this little area over here, kind of to the north of Israel, these were folks that lived in a culture that was a little closer to what Israel was. And they had this clan system. And even though they had kings from a very early point, we see this very strange thing where the kings, hundreds of years before Israel existed, this is like 600 years before Moses was born. So very, very ancient. But we can see them negotiating with elders and with like groups of people. So we have this letter, which I won't read you the whole thing, but they don't say the people, they say the commoners, like, the peasants. But the peasants actually got together to revolt, and then they carried out deliberations, and the commoners went over to the side of this general. So there's a coup that happens, and the commoners end up supporting this guy to become king, and it actually works. That is to say, there's some deliberations between these people, and this kingdom of Mari, it's this place right here. This guy Zimri Lim ended up getting killed by Hammurabi. He lived at the same time as Hammurabi, king of Babylon. So Hammurabi came and killed him. But before that, this guy had to negotiate with his tribal elders and with his kind of commoners, kind of another word for the people. And these are the kind of people, this is that area, that general area where Israel came from. So Israel comes from a people. So Israel doesn't make this up all by themselves, although they make up some words by themselves. But they come from a people who are kind of fiercely democratic, at least in a, again, proto-way, primitive way, whatever you want to call it. It's kind of pre-democracy democracy. So that idea of the people of Israel we see radiating through Israel's founding documents, we might call it, in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, the law codes. And I mentioned covenant. I don't know, you probably have already heard this a million times, but covenant is not a religious word in the ancient world, not at all. And it's used of no religious ceremony, no religious relationship in the ancient world outside of Israel. Nobody uses this word for anything religious because it's a contract. You don't make contracts with kings. You also don't make contracts with gods. They don't want to make contracts. They're powerful. That's why they're gods, right? Sorry, Zeus doesn't make contracts with people. I'm going to deliver you. So no, Zeus does what Zeus wants to do. That's what being a god is all about, right? Horus and Isis, and they do whatever they want to do. They have to fight with other gods sometimes, but they don't make contracts with them either. So this idea of a covenant, it was just a contract used in business purposes, for buying land, for getting married. Today, even in Jewish communities, they'll sign a ketuvah, a marriage contract. That's the actual moment of marriage in a Jewish ceremony. So this covenant had family kind of relationships. It had kind of a usefulness in diplomacy. So when a contract was made, an alliance between two kings, they would sign a covenant together. I won't attack you, you don't attack me. And then they would call each other brothers. Now we're brothers. Or if one was more powerful, it'd be like, I'm your father and you're my son. But these fictitious family relationships would come out of these covenants that people would sign with each other that had business purposes and so on. This one here, this is the oldest contract for beer that we know of in the ancient world. This is a little pictures for grain. So they say all the grain they're going to deliver, and I'm going to give you all this grain, and you're going to give me all this beer. That's down over here. So over here, this is the world's oldest peace treaty that we've got. This is another covenant from the ancient world. The world's oldest peace, the Treaty of Kadesh. Today it's in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, but it's between the Hittites, who were ancient Turkey, and the Egyptians from the 13th century BC, before the time of Moses. So this is what the people thought of when they thought of covenants. Well, they thought of contracts. A covenant, a peace treaty, something like that. That's just a little close-up of Kadesh. Or a marriage contract, a relationship. Also, adopting a child would be a berit, a covenant. And they would negotiate these kinds of things if you were sort of old enough to do so. They would sign actual contracts. Now, in ancient Israel, they talk about their relationship with each other and with their God as a contract or a covenant, which, again, is really strange. No ancient people uses this term to talk about their God. And people made fun of Israel for it. Oh, you're the one that makes contracts with your God? Business, I'm making a contract with my God. They would have joked about that. And they would have thought, your God must be so weak that you can negotiate. Anyone here who's negotiated a contract knows, like, the whole purpose of having a contract is so you can hold someone accountable, right? To get some power over them. Israel's God allowed the people, to have power over the God? How weird and gross, ancient people would have thought. But for ancient Israel, this idea of the covenant was the core of their political life and their religious life. And to them, it was the same thing. Their God had called them into a relationship with each other, with God and the world, that was based on God actually giving of God's self and self-limiting God's ultimate power so that God could be in relationship with us and with the world. And in ancient Israel's idea, the whole point of Israel, going back to Genesis 12 and the calling of Abraham and Sarah, the whole purpose of this people was for God, this is Genesis 12, verse 3, to bring blessing to all the peoples of the world. And when they get to the mountain in Exodus 19, they're called out from Egypt. They're saved, but they're not saved just in general. They're saved for a particular purpose, to become a people who's going to do something. And in Exodus 19, Moses says, or God says to Moses on the mountain, Moses, please tell all Israel this. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So I saved you. That's salvation. I saved you. Salvation comes first in the Old Testament. Then comes the law or the contract. The contract comes next. So grace comes first. You don't earn salvation in the Old Testament. No Jews ever tried to earn salvation. Christians say that about Jews, but that's not true. Jews say we were saved a long time ago. We were saved. We are saved. The saving comes first. The grace comes first. And then comes the relationship, which does have stipulations. And the stipulations have a purpose. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, so God's going to offer a contract to ancient Israel. And if you want to abide by the covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession out of all peoples. Now, God says, that doesn't mean that I don't like other peoples or that you're like better in some way. God says, the whole earth is mine. I love all the people. But you, the point of the contract is that you will be a priestly kingdom for me and a holy nation. I'm going to set you apart as holy, different, other, so that you can be like priestly people to all the peoples of the world. So all of Israel is a priest in this way, mediating God's blessing to the peoples of the world. That's what the purpose of the covenant is, to reform Israel, to become the kind of people who are going to share God's blessing to the ends of the earth. So in that sense, God then lays out some laws. Many of these laws we know, laws like don't have any other gods before me. It's a covenant. It's a marriage contract in a way. It's exclusive, right? Like, I don't want you, like, going around hanging out with other gods, and I find out you're at the bar with another god, Like, that is to say, like, it's a real deal, right? But also, there's a couple of things that are really interesting, especially if we compare them with ancient law codes. Ancient law codes, they have laws that sound a lot like what you find in Exodus. Some of them are taken in Exodus, just taken from the law of Hammurabi, like the ox goring law, literally quoted from the laws of Hammurabi, which were famous. Scribes wrote them as an exercise to learn how to write laws. So everyone knew these. And some of them are good, the interesting laws, and so they borrowed some of these for ancient Israel. But the things that you don't find in other law codes, that you find in the law codes of ancient Israel, are calls for everyone to be concerned about the well-being of the whole community. This is not something you find in the laws of Hammurabi. This is not something you find in ancient laws in Egypt. Everyone needs to care for everyone else. Like, you need to be nice to your parents. That's one of the 10 commandments. You need to be nice to elderly people. What? No. Hammurabi doesn't tell you to be nice to elderly. Is that in the Code of Georgia? Like, no, this is you can't legislate that. Love your parents, be nice, have warm stuff in your heart about your parents. This is pretty weird stuff to find in any law code in the ancient world or the modern. And yet, God is asking the people to deeply care for everyone in your community, especially the marginal and the vulnerable. We find stuff like this. This is from Exodus 22, verse 21. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You were wandering, vulnerable people, and I helped you so that you would know what it's like to be a vulnerable, wandering person, so that you would then help wandering, vulnerable people. Now, wandering, vulnerable people, aliens, are not mentioned in any ancient law code outside of Israel. Why? Because they have no rights. They have no rights in Babylon. They have no rights in Egypt. They're wandering people. Only people who live here, citizens, have the right? They didn't use the word citizens then, but the subjects of the king. They have the right. But the people who are wandering around, they're going to steal your water, your food, they're out to get you, right? Ancient Israel, Yahweh says, no, actually, we're here for a different purpose. We're here so we can be a blessing to all the peoples of the world. And let's remember the vulnerable. And then also, widows and orphans. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. Don't take advantage of vulnerable people. Orphans and widows aren't in the body of any ancient law code. They're not protected by any law in any ancient culture in this part of the world, except Israel's. Orphans, widows, and then Deuteronomy starts to talk about a group called the poor. This is not something you find like people talking about in the ancient world, people who just don't have a lot of stuff all the time. That's a good thing for Pharaoh, In the ancient world, they didn't have like Google. Like, they didn't like think you could just like invent new stuff that would like bring wealth to everyone. The pie was limited. Everything depends on how much water you have. It's not getting any more, and you can't find any more water. You're not synthesizing it out of the air or something. So there's a limited pie, and if someone's getting more, that means Pharaoh's getting less. So no, the Pharaoh doesn't want you to get out of poverty, right? That's your lot in life that the gods gave you. Ancient Israel says, actually, everyone's supposed to have the same amount of land. Land then wasn't like front yards, it was like to grow stuff. Like everyone gets a plot that's enough for them. Everyone's going to get a minimum amount of land that's enough for them and their family to survive on in perpetuity. And you can't take it away from them, or at least you shouldn't. Later the kings do, of course. But this idea that everyone should be treated as a full part of the community, even if they're just visiting us. And we should make sure they have enough to take care of themselves and their families. And if they don't, then we need to help them. Like this is just the bare bones idea of what it means to be a covenant community to ancient Israel. And that God has shown that God wants to care for the vulnerable. What does Pharaoh do with the vulnerable? Pharaoh takes advantage of them and then gives you the benefits of it, right? They all share in the benefits. There's an image that I didn't want to show you because it's kind of gross, but an image of the Libyans, who are neighbors to Egypt, that were starving. And so Pharaoh went and sent soldiers and took all their stuff because they were starving and couldn't fight back. And there's this image of these starving Libyans with like their, rib cages showing, and the Egyptians carved this into stone later on, and you see the soldiers just taking their stuff and then enslaving some of them and taking them back to work for them. So this is, in that world, saying, no, actually, you don't do this to the vulnerable. You're supposed to care for all of them, no matter who they are, even if they hate you. That is a radical statement, one that, people often don't live up to in the ancient world or the modern. But that notion of the covenant is so radical, and it all comes from this idea of the people being the political body. And that when things happen that make us ask questions, okay, who is a vulnerable person? Or what do we do in this circumstance? Or what about this piece of land right here? There's no individual person whose job it is to make the decision. When the people have problems, in the early period at least, Yahweh tells them, let's talk about it. So the elders have to get together to negotiate stuff. And we see this happen. So there's some issues here among the people. But before we get to the issues and how they solve them, I just want to point out a couple of things. The Sinai covenant is a religious revolution. It's a revolution in the ancient world. It's a new way of seeing how to relate to God. It's the first known address from a God to a people. Y'all, when a God says y'all. Gods don't say y'all in the ancient world. They talk to kings, they talk to high priests, and that gets inscribed, right? They don't really talk, I don't really think the gods of Babylon talk to the Babylonian priests, but nonetheless, the priests say they do, right? Priests don't write stuff in stone for everyone to read that says, hey, the God told me that y'all are great, right? That is to say, the kings give decrees to the people, but the kings often don't name them as the people. Sometimes the king will say subjects, like the people that I rule over, that's your name. Your name is the ones that I rule over, but I don't address you all like as a group because that's dangerous. But gods in the ancient world weren't understood to speak to everyone at the same time. But in Deuteronomy and Exodus, we find a God who says y'all. The first time we find in world history that we know of, a direct address to a group of people from a God. The first known claim that a people had made a covenant with a deity, that's Israel. There's no priest or official religious hierarchy mentioned, or political hierarchy mentioned, we'll get to that in a minute, within the law codes. There's no, it's just all the people. They have to negotiate with each other how to do worship. And then covenant actually binds the people to the God, not a king or a priest or a prophet. The people are all bound together by the covenant itself. There's not a person, a king, who is the glue that binds everything together. We don't see this. We don't see evidence of this. It had to have happened in the ancient world, but the folks who lived this way didn't have also writing technology or giant inscriptions to be able to write it down or pass it down like this. So Israel's the first people that we know of who had the ability, the power, the money, the resources, whatever, to kind of copy this stuff down and pass it down to us. So it's also a political revolution, right? We don't have a people being called y'all, not just by God, but at all. No literature addressed such a y'all, the people, before the Bible. This is the first known speech. The people say, God says to the people in Exodus, what do y'all think? And the people say, yes, we want to do this. The people speak. This is the first time in the ancient world that we know of where a people speak. Peoples don't speak in the ancient world. It's the first known combination of a covenant with a law code. Like the law code itself is negotiable by a contract. Sorry, but Hammurabi doesn't care what you think. You're not going to negotiate your way out of any laws that Hammurabi wants to make. And then law codes and covenants don't ever mention in the ancient world a king. This law code don't mention a king or an official political hierarchy. Of course, they're mentioned in every ancient law code that we know of in the ancient world. So the last one is important too. This is not a bloodline-limited group. The group that leaves Egypt that makes this covenant, they're called a mixed multitude in Exodus 12. A mixed multitude. These are people from all over the world who are in Egypt for lots of reasons. Some Egyptians, some people from Syria, some people from the Hittite, kind of the area of Turkey, people from Greece. Greek peoples lived there. There's a bunch of people who just leave. They leave with Moses because this is a new way. They're being called to it. We know that there's injustice in the law. Sorry, I'll finish in just a minute. We know there's injustice in the law. The law in Exodus talks about slavery. It's like in there. It talks about gender injustice. It talks about how men get certain privileges and rights that women don't have, which might lead us to say, well, this whole thing was a bad idea. How could this possibly be from God? But even before they leave Sinai, they start to negotiate this law. Certain people realize that, hey, I'm left out of this law. And when the people realize that, they bring it up to Moses and the elders. And Moses and the elders talk to each other and then to God, and they negotiate with the people who have been left out, and they end up making new law. This happens a few times within the books of the Torah. So the law of Moses includes within it people realizing the law is not good enough, and they're going to have to make it better. Why didn't God give a perfect law in the first place? Well, what law code would function in perpetuity for all cultures in all times, right? We're going to have to keep changing this law code. It's going to have to change to fit with different times, different places, different communities. When Paul starts to invite Gentiles in, Celtic people like me, we're weirdos, in the ancient world. And we have weird customs, and so we're going to have to adapt the law to our own weird ways of life. And in that same way, the adaptation of the law is going to have to happen. And even before they leave Sinai, in Numbers 9, people negotiate a new Passover because there was a way of doing Passover that left some people out. People said, you're leaving us out. We can't celebrate Passover with you because of this weird law. And Moses says, wow, that is a weird law. God, you made a weird law. And God says, good, you got it. Okay, see what we got to do? You notice who's being left out, and we're going to negotiate a new law. And God says, new law. So we do this with the daughters of Zelophehad as well, a group of women who are upstanding citizens. Their father was an upstanding citizen, and yet the land regulations in ancient Israel's law code leave them out. When their father dies, they haven't yet married, they're young women, and because their father died and there's no sons, the hereditary laws of the ancient Near East, which Israel just kind of took, don't include women. So these women just don't get any land. The land gets distributed to other people. And bummer, they just become poor widows. They haven't even got married yet, but no one's going to marry them because they don't have any land to bring to the relationship. And this is a real bummer. Everything's bad for these. These women are just already written out. They haven't even gotten to the land yet. So they're still hanging out with Moses in the wilderness. And Moses ends up saying, this is Numbers 27. This is a great little text. The women say, you have to give us, and this is a command, you should give us a possession, give us a land and a land inheritance among our father's brothers. We have to get land. You need to give us land. And Moses did not say, oh, well, we already got God's law. It's all good. God gave us the law. We can't change that. It's God's law, What Moses says is, yeah, you're right. The daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they're saying. And yeah, let's try to get them to do this. So Moses then gets the elders together and they pray, they talk to God. God ends up kind of coming down and being like, yeah, boy, you're right. These women got written out just for being women. That's wrong. So they shall get an inheritance. And then God goes on and makes some new laws. And then at the end of the book of Numbers 36, the tribes people, the leaders of the clans, come back together and they say, you know what? God made a new law in Numbers 27 that they could marry whoever they wanted and keep the land. But we see another value that's being interrupted here. There's a tension because there's a value that God had also said about the equity of land. All land should be equally shared between the tribes, that everyone should get access to land. And if they marry outside their tribe, this could begin a kind of a cascade of other tribes trying to marry to get more land for themselves, right? You can see this becomes a game of power and manipulation. This could be a real problem. And so Moses says, good point. And God says, good point. So the elders, God, Moses, the people, and the daughters all get together again to renegotiate the law. What works for us now? And they end up coming to a compromise. The compromise is the women can marry whoever they want within their tribe, which is, big group of people, large group of people, but for the purposes of the equity of the land, for this other principle, right? We had principles in tension, and people's voices have been heard who are not worried about their own gain, but are worried about the principles that underlie the core values of communal well-being and of care for the vulnerable that sometimes can be in some tension. But those are the two values that they keep. They don't change laws all the time for no purpose. It's those two values, communal well-being and care for the vulnerable. And those keep coming back up again and again in ancient Israel's history in this democratic way. Of course, they get kings, but those kings still have to deal with stuff. Now, last minute. Jesus, right, becomes the king, but a king like no other king. It's all ironic in the Gospels, Jesus' kingship, right? In the Gospel of Mark, he's like, he's a king, ha, ha, ha. At the very end, right, the Roman guy laughs, like at the centurion. He's like, yeah, surely that guy's the son, the guy who just died on the cross. Surely that's the son of God. He's a real Hercules, that guy. This got nailed up on a cross, right? Ancient Christians were so worried about the depiction of Jesus. The crucifixion was so worrisome and sad to them and ultimately shameful. Their God died. This is the first depiction of the crucifixion we've got. This is from the 5th century. The 5th century. It took them 500 years to draw the crucifixion. The idea of Jesus being a king who died shamefully, right, still rankled people. But just to know that this is the kind of, Jesus is king, but it's a really different kind of kingship that we're seeing here. A kingship that cares about the vulnerable and cares about communal well-being all throughout Jesus' ministry. So we also get Athenian democracy that emerges in the meantime. And Paul begins to call this new community the ecclesia, the church. But that word ecclesia, the called out ones, he's borrowing that from Athenian democracy. That's the word for the town council. All the citizens get together to make decisions. That's what ecclesia means. That's what he's calling the church community, the called out ones. The town council is another word for this. So Paul's like, you all are the town council. There are deacons, there are leaders, there are people who are in different ways, given some kind of authority to minister, to preach, to teach. But ultimately, you are a democrat. You are a body of people who has been distributed and are organized by this covenant, the new covenant that Jesus shares with you at the table. That's the real core relationship. And of course, you Presbyterians know, this is the core, right, of federal theology or covenant theology. Federal, right? That comes from fetus, the Latin word for covenant. So the covenant being the core of this, right? This is what leads many people in the Reformation to start developing new ways of thinking about church polity, right? How churches are built and how they relate to each other, how the group is organized. We start getting federal theologians or covenant theologians like Johannes Althusius, who start to really think about, okay, maybe this should apply to more than just the church. Maybe we should live this way. And we start to get people like the Mayflower Covenant who start to say, covenant and the people, covenant and the people. We see this in the Old Testament. And let's try to live this out, right? They do it imperfectly, improperly, right? At the same time, they're trying to make a new way of life that lives this covenant into existence. And covenants became so important in early America. Paul Revere was part of a bell ringer's covenant when he was 14 years old. That's his signature over there when he signed. The little kids who rung the bell at the church signed a covenant with each other. Everyone was making covenants in early America because it was the thing to do. That was how we were organizing ourselves. And of course, this led to conflict with the king and Thomas Paine when he writes Common Sense. The common sense was actually not common sense. It was no one should have a king. That's what he said. No one should have a king. And everyone said common sense was that the king was given by God. So if you get rid of the king, God's going to hate you and kill you. Most Americans thought that when Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense. The point of him writing this was it's an exegesis. It's a close reading of 1 Samuel 8 through 12 where God says, I hate kings. And Thomas Paine says, see, God doesn't like kings either. God prefers federal, covenantal self-organization of the people. That's what God really likes. And eventually, it became common sense for Americans like James Madison, Presbyterians. But then also, we can see this idea of a beloved community, this kind of covenantal beloved community begins to develop in American politics. And there are people who call us out in certain times and places when we aren't living up to the covenant, when we aren't living up to caring for communal well-being and care for the vulnerable. And these folks, like Martin Luther King Jr., like Rabbi Abraham Heschel, call us back to this time and again. Now, I'm not telling you there's a particular political platform that always does this right. I think we've got problems everywhere we look, but that's part of human nature. But for us, one thing I want to leave us with ourselves as a community, both individually, kind of as this church, but as this town, as a state, as a country, that cares for each other. There are different ways to meet that goal. But if we think about ourselves that way and think that maybe God is actually with us in this process, it might change our ways of thinking about our involvement, even in our messed up national democratic politics that we have today, which may be difficult, but still, I think, are a blessing. All right, I know I went over, I'm sorry, but y'all have worship in a few minutes. I'll stick around and ask questions. Feel free to ask them, but also I know most people need to go. Apologies, and thanks.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you to Dr. Brennan.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, appreciate it. Yeah.